Hey, Mark Clark here, the author of The Problem of God, and we're exploring the big questions that skeptics have against Christianity, the reasons they reject it. And this one's a big one, it's the problem of sex. And so the reality is a lot of people would say, well, the reason I reject Christianity is because of my epistemology or my philosophy and so on and so forth. But I think sometimes the reason behind the reason is important. And oftentimes when I talk to people on the streets of the city that I belong to, it's really this issue, is they look at the ethic of sexuality that Christianity has and they say, I don't want anything to do with that. Meaning I want to live my variety is the spice of life and I want to be able to sleep around and do whatever I want to do. And the ethic of an idea of the biblical concept of sex is not something I want to live my life by. And so what is that ethic? Sometimes what I find is that people look at Christianity and say God is anti-sex. And here's the big thing we got to understand, that the Bible and God are not anti-sex at all. God is the most pro-sex person in the universe. Think about it. Go back to Genesis 1 and 2. God created man and woman in a garden with no clothes and gave them a command to be fruitful and multiply. Literally, the first thing he comes out of the gate with is you're naked and I want you to have sex. I want you to multiply. I want you to have joy. I want you to have pleasure. I want you to delight in this. The concept that Christians have come up with, where God simply wants us to have sex just for procreation, with the lights off, is not a biblical one. The reality is the Bible goes, you read Song of Solomon, which is a book about the sexual relationship of two people. It'll make you sweat when you read that book because it's full of beautiful sexual metaphors of a married couple enjoying one another's bodies, not just for procreation, but for pleasure. And that's what we got to understand is Jesus actually spoke about the idea of marriage between a man and a woman. And in that context, you're supposed to have pleasure. You're supposed to have joy. It's going to protect you. Later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul talks about the idea that you owe it to your spouse to actually have what he calls conjugal rights, and that we don't own our own bodies, that we're serving one another in the context of our bodies so that Satan can't actually get into your marriage, so you're protecting your marriage from outside forces and temptations elsewhere. And so the reality is I've met with people over the years, they constantly, once they understand the actual ethic of Christianity, that God looks at human beings and says, I want you to have pleasure in this. I want sexuality to be a pointer to the kind of God that I am. Think about that. The way he designed the human body. There's parts of the human body that have no reproductive value. They're only made for the context of pleasure. That's the God that I serve. The God who would say, and so it's almost an evangelistic point. It's almost a point to say, look at the context of sexuality. Don't you want to know the God who created that? Because there's other ways he could have created us just to procreate and not really enjoy it that much. But the reality is God over and over again in the scriptures says, I want you to enjoy one another in the context of marriage. And the reality is, here's a myth, that the way to have ultimate pleasure is by being single, playing the field, going out there. But actually, a ton of secular studies have now come back and said that the highest levels of sexuality in regard to the amount of sex in a given week and the amount of pleasure reported in the context of marriage versus the context of being single, that it's higher in marriage than it is in being single. That there's people having more sex and better sex because good sex is actually hard work. Because you learn each other's bodies in the way, and it takes time and energy and effort and sometimes years for sex to move from good to great. And the reality is good is the enemy of great, not only in the world of business and economics, but in the world of sexuality. And so the actual context of covenant marriage between a man and a woman is the highest level of reported pleasure and the amount of sex being had versus the single life. So the mythology of you're out there and you're having sex with all kinds of different people and that's the good life. And being married, that's when things go downhill and you all sit there and you're bored with life. That's actually a myth. And the most secular studies in the world are showing that over and over and over again. And so the reality is God actually knew what he was talking about when he laid down this reality in Genesis 1 and 2 and said, and here's the thing. The beautiful part about the Bible is Adam and Eve were in the garden and there were no other people around. There was just animals around. And the principle of this is once you're married, you're not supposed to look around. The thing that will kill your marriage is comparison. Stop looking around at other couples and thinking, I have to have it that way, or they're having a better life than me. There was only Adam and Eve. And they looked at each other and they said, there are no other options. And so your spouse becomes the ultimate measure of beauty. And that's the thing you need to be working on versus looking around at Instagram or comparing yourself to other people. That will kill your marriage. So look to your spouse and work on it together and recognize that even the goodness of your sex life brings God glory. It's not something other than that.